Geoffroy Thérage was a man who didn't believe in miracles. He couldn't afford to. As the official executioner of Rouen, Geoffroy was the final, brutal punctuation mark at the end of a prisoner's life. He had ended hundreds of them. He had watched the light leave the eyes of kings and thieves alike. He understood the mechanics of the human body, how bone snaps under tension, how flesh yields to steel, and how quickly a life turns to cold meat. To him, death was a predictable, biological certainty. But on the evening of May 30th, 1431, Geoffroy Thérage did something he had never done in his long, bloody career. He broke. He didn't go to the tavern to drink away the day's work. He didn't go to sleep. He collapsed into the shadows of a monastery, clutching at the robes of the friars, weeping in a state of absolute, paralyzed terror. Through the heavy sobs, he made a confession that would chill the clergy to their marrow. He claimed that he had committed a mortal sin, that he had burned a saint. And his proof? It wasn't a voice from heaven or a vision in the sky. It was something tangible, something physical that defied every law of nature he had spent his life witnessing. Amidst the white-hot ash of a pyre meant to erase a woman from existence, lay a bloody, beating heart that refused to turn to ash. This is the curiosity gap that history cannot close. Think about the physics for a moment. This was the high pyre. The English didn't just want Joan of Arc dead. They wanted her vaporized. They built a structure of wood and sulfur designed to reach temperatures hot enough to melt lead. A human body, especially one as slight as a 19-year-old peasant girl, should have been reduced to fine, gray dust in less than an hour. How does a 19-year-old girl, after being scorched by a fire hot enough to melt lead, leave behind a perfectly preserved heart? Was it a freak occurrence of biology? A rare medical phenomenon where the internal organs are cauterized by a flashover of heat? Or was it a final defiant message from something beyond this world? A sign that the fire could take the breath, but it could never touch the soul? Welcome to Real History Documentary. Today, we are stepping into the smoke and the shadows to uncover the chilling, verified details of Joan of Arc's final days. We aren't just telling a story. We are analyzing a crime scene that is 600 years old. If you love the dark corners of history, where the facts are stranger than any fiction, subscribe now and hit the bell. You won't want to miss a single second of this. To understand why the heart wouldn't burn, we first have to understand the fire that tried to break it. And that fire didn't start in the market square. It started in a courtroom. Let's head inside, because the execution was just the end of a much more dangerous game. Rouen, 1431. To the world outside, spring was arriving, but inside the towers of the castle, time had died. Joan of Arc didn't sit in a prisoner's cell. She lived in a psychological vacuum. She was kept in a boule, an iron cage, chained by her neck, hands and feet to a massive wooden beam. She was 19 years old. She was exhausted, and she was being hunted by the most brilliant minds in Europe. But her real enemy wasn't the men with the swords. It was the man with the ledger, Bishop Pierre Cauchon. If this story were a movie, Cauchon would be the perfect villain, but he didn't see himself that way. He saw himself as a surgeon cutting out a cancer. Cauchon's motive was simple, brutal, and entirely political. You see, Joan had done the impossible. She had led an army to crown Charles VII as the King of France. If Cauchon could prove that Joan was a witch, that her voices came from the devil and not from God, then the king's crown was illegitimate. It would mean the King of France was a puppet of Satan. This wasn't a trial about a girl's soul. It was a political assassination masked as a religious inquiry. Imagine the contrast. On one side, 60 men who had spent their entire lives studying Latin, law, and the complex nuances of theology. They were the giants of the medieval world. On the other side, a peasant girl who couldn't read a single sentence. She had no lawyer, no advisor, no friends. She was forbidden from receiving the Eucharist. She was alone in a room full of wolves who had already decided on the verdict before she even opened her mouth. For weeks, they hammered at her. They questioned her for hours without food, trying to catch her in a technical lie. They asked her about her childhood, her virginity, the clothes she wore, and the signs she gave the king. They were looking for one crack, one slip of the tongue that they could turn into a death warrant. But Joan didn't crack. She was sharper, faster, and more grounded than any of them expected. On February 24th, they decided to spring the ultimate trap. This was the checkmate question. In medieval theology, if you claimed to know for certain that you were in God's grace, you were guilty of the sin of arrogance, a heretic. But if you said you were not in God's grace, you were admitting you were a sinner and a fraud. Then Bishop Cauchon asked, "Joan, tell us, are you in God's grace?" If she says yes, she's a heretic. If she says no, she's a liar. There is no middle ground. The trap is perfectly sealed. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like an eternity. Joan replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was the most brilliant answer in legal history. Even her enemies were momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, uneducated genius of it. She had threaded a needle that should have been impossible to find. She had outmaneuvered the giants. But the trial didn't end there. Cauchon knew he couldn't win on logic, so he moved to exhaustion. They moved the trial to her cell. They questioned her while she was ill. They threatened her with the rack and the cord. They told her that if she didn't submit to the church, meaning them, she would be burned alive and her soul would vanish into the void. The pressure was designed to erase her identity. They weren't just trying to kill her body. They were trying to kill the maid. They wanted a confession. They wanted her to say that the voices of Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret that had guided her from the fields of Domremy to the siege of Orléans were nothing but delusions or demons. They thought they had broken her. They thought the trap had finally snapped shut. But they didn't realize that by trying to extinguish the girl, they were about to light a fire that would consume the very foundations of their power. Because the nightmare in the old market square was about to begin. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, the psychological game ended and the physical nightmare began. Joan had briefly signed a recantation to save her life, but within days she recanted the recantation. She put her male clothes back on, a final act of defiance, claiming that her voices had told her she had damned her soul to save her life. The English had what they wanted. A relapsed heretic. In the eyes of the law, she was now fuel for the flames. This wasn't a standard execution. Usually, executioners used a small fire, and the prisoner died quickly from smoke inhalation, essentially suffocating before the flames ever touched them. But the English were terrified of Joan's influence. They ordered Geoffroy Thérage to build a high pyre. They wanted her so high above the crowd that the smoke wouldn't hide her. They wanted every person in Rouen to watch her skin blacken. They wanted to ensure there was no doubt the maid was mortal. Joan is led out. She wears a long, rough shift. On her head is a paper mitre, a hat of shame, labelled with the words heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater. She walked through the jeering crowd, but the atmosphere began to shift. The hatred was being replaced by a heavy, suffocating sense of dread. Joan didn't curse her executioners. She prayed. She asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by a sudden, inexplicable impulse of pity, took 2 sticks from the ground and tied them together with a piece of twine. He handed her this crude cross of twigs. She kissed it and tucked it against her chest, beneath her robes. Geoffroy lit the base. Because of the height of the structure, the heat didn't rise and choke her with smoke immediately. Instead, the fire climbed the wood like a living thing. The witnesses recorded that the heat was so intense, the air itself seemed to vibrate. The crowd, which had been shouting for her blood moments ago, fell into a deathly silence. She didn't scream for mercy. She didn't scream at Cauchon, who stood watching from a safe distance. She screamed one word, over and over again, her voice piercing through the roar of the inferno until it grew thin and raspy. "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!" She kept her eyes fixed on a processional cross that a friar held up for her at the foot of the pyre, until the smoke finally swallowed her whole. Once the screaming stopped, the English grew paranoid. They feared people would claim she had escaped or been rescued by a miracle. They ordered Geoffroy Thérage to do the unthinkable, to move the fire aside while it was still burning, to reveal the charred remains and prove she was dead. The wood was gone, her clothes were gone, her flesh had been scorched away, but as Geoffroy pushed through the center of the ribcage, he froze. The rake hit something solid, something that didn't crumble. There, in the center of the devastation, sat her heart. Amidst the white-hot ash that had melted lead, the organ was bright, vivid crimson. It was full of blood. It was perfectly intact. Geoffroy Thérage looked at the heart, then at his hands, and realized that the fire hadn't finished the job. It had only revealed a mystery that would haunt the world for the next 6 centuries. The screaming had stopped, but the whispering was just beginning, and the English were about to find out that a heart that won't burn is much more dangerous than a girl who will. The fire was supposed to be the end of the story. The English had paid Geoffroy Thérage to perform a vanishing act. They didn't just want Joan of Arc dead. They wanted her deleted from history. They wanted to ensure that by the time the sun went down, there wouldn't be a single piece of her left for a Frenchman to weep over, or a soldier to draw inspiration from. But as the smoke began to thin, Geoffroy Thérage realized he hadn't performed an execution. He had performed a miracle he didn't want to see. Amidst the white-hot center of the debris, a place where the temperature had spiked high enough to melt the lead off the cathedral roofs, something was staring back at him. It wasn't gray, it wasn't black. It was a deep, pulsing, vivid crimson. It was a human heart. Geoffroy stood there, frozen. He had burned hundreds of people. He knew what a human body looked like after an hour in the flames. It's supposed to be unrecognizable. It's supposed to be carbon and dust. But this defied every law of nature he had spent his life witnessing. He later told the monks at the monastery of Saint-Ouen that the heart was full of blood and as fresh as if it had been taken from a living person that very second. He tried to burn it again. He was terrified. He piled more dry wood and sulfur onto the remains, stoking a second fire to consume the evidence of his sin. But when those flames died down, the heart was still there. Let's talk about the why, because if you're a skeptic, you're looking for a biological loophole. How does a 19-year-old girl stay intact inside a furnace? First, we have to look at the moisture theory. The human heart is a dense, muscular pump. It's essentially a thick-walled bag of fluid. Some modern pathologists suggest that if the outer fire is intense enough, it can flash fry the exterior of the torso, creating a carbonized shell. In theory, this shell acts as a biological thermos, keeping the internal organs at a lower temperature while the outside vaporizes. But here's the problem with that theory. Joan wasn't in a normal fire. This was the 3-tiered high pyre. The English had specifically ordered a structure so tall that the executioner couldn't reach the victim to provide a mercy killing. In a standard pyre, the executioner might strangle the prisoner or use a short fire to kill them with smoke. But for Joan, the heat rose in stages. The first stage scorched her extremities. The second stage gutted her. The third stage, the coal bed, was designed to turn everything into fine ash. Even if the heart had been cauterized in the first 10 minutes, the sheer duration of that 3-stage fire should have turned the water in her cells into steam, causing the heart to literally explode from the internal pressure. It didn't explode. It didn't shrivel. It sat there, defiant in the eye of the storm. This was a PR nightmare of biblical proportions. The English had fought this trial to prove Joan was a puppet of the devil. But the devil's heart doesn't survive a holy fire. If word got out to the streets of Rouen, if the 10,000 people who just watched her die heard that her heart was unburnable, the war was over. The French would see it as the ultimate God-tier sign of her innocence. They would see it as God himself stepping into the fire and placing a shield over the girl's soul. The English soldiers were already starting to break. One English secretary was recorded as crying out, "We are lost, for we have burned a saint." The atmosphere in the square had shifted from a carnival of execution to a funeral of regret. The English commanders gave Geoffroy a final, desperate order: erase the miracle. They didn't just want the heart gone. They wanted it forgotten. They forced Geoffroy to gather the heart, the entrails, and every remaining shard of her bone. They didn't let him bury them in a cemetery. They didn't let him keep the ashes. Under heavy armed guard, they marched the executioner to the edge of the Matilda Bridge, overlooking the dark, cold waters of the Seine River. Imagine the weight of that bucket. Geoffroy Thérage, the man who had ended hundreds of lives without a second thought, was now shaking so hard he could barely stand. He believed that by throwing that heart into the river, he was drowning his own soul. He tipped the bucket. The English thought they were being clever. They thought that by throwing her into the water, they were preventing her from becoming a relic. They wanted her to be nowhere. They wanted her to be silt and mud. But they made a fatal mistake in the psychology of war. By trying to hide the miracle, they turned it into a legend. You can burn a body and you can drown a heart, but you cannot kill an idea once it has been baptized in fire. Geoffroy Thérage walked off that bridge and straight into a breakdown. He died shortly after, convinced that no amount of prayer would ever wash the soot of May 30th off his hands. He was the first to realize what the English hadn't. The heart didn't burn because the story wasn't over. It was just moving into the next phase. They thought they had disposed of a witch. They had actually just planted the seed of a revolution that would haunt them for the next 6 centuries. They thought that by throwing her remains into the river, they had erased her. The English commanders went to bed on the night of May 30th, believing they had won. They had the girl's ashes in the mud, her heart at the bottom of the Seine, and a legal document signed by 60 of the greatest minds in Europe calling her a witch. But as the sun rose over Rouen the next morning, a strange, suffocating silence settled over the city. The victory didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like a curse. The ghost of Joan of Arc didn't haunt the battlefields. It haunted the consciences of the men who killed her. Within days, the stories began to leak. People spoke of the unburnable heart. They spoke of the dove that supposedly flew out of the flames. The executioner's breakdown became public knowledge. The English hadn't created a vacuum where a girl used to be. They had created a void that the French people were now filling with the image of a martyr. Justice is often a slow-moving beast, and in the case of Joan of Arc, it took a quarter of a century to catch up. By 1456, the war had turned. The English had been almost entirely driven out of France, just as Joan had predicted they would be. King Charles VII, the man she had crowned, realized he had a problem. If he owed his throne to a woman the church had officially labeled a heretic and a witch, then his entire reign was built on a lie. In one of the most emotional scenes in legal history, Joan's mother, Isabel, appeared before the Pope's representatives. She was old, she was grieving, and she had spent 25 years fighting for her daughter's name. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for land. She asked for the truth. The Pope reopened the case. This nullification trial wasn't just a quick rewrite of history. They called 115 witnesses, the soldiers who fought beside her, the peasants who grew up with her, and even the judges who had sat on the original panel. One by one, the truth came out. The threats, the exhaustion, the illegal tactics of the first trial were laid bare. The verdict was finally delivered. The original trial was full of corruption, cousinage, calumny, fraud, and malice. Joan was declared innocent, not just of heresy, but of every charge they had ever laid against her. And what of the man who lit the fuse? Bishop Pierre Cauchon didn't live to see his work undone. He died suddenly in 1442, reportedly while being shaved by his barber. But his death wasn't the end of his punishment. During the reversal of Joan's trial, Cauchon was posthumously excommunicated. He was cast out of the very church he had used as a weapon to destroy a 19-year-old girl. In the end, his name became a synonym for Judas in French history. He sought immortality through a political execution, and he found it as one of the most hated villains in the history of the faith. They burned her body, but they created a legend that would unite France for 600 years. In 1920, the church went a step further and officially canonized her as a saint. But the mystery of the heart remains. To this day, historians and scientists debate what Geoffroy Thérage actually saw in those ashes. Was it a miracle? Was it a freak occurrence of thermodynamics where the heart was preserved by the very fire that was meant to consume it? Or was it something else? A symbolic truth that has become a physical fact through centuries of storytelling. The heart was never found. It remains somewhere in the silt of the Seine, a hidden relic of a girl who changed the map of Europe. But perhaps that's exactly how it was meant to be. The executioner died, claiming he would never be forgiven for what he did. He believed the heart didn't burn because it was a sign of his own damnation. But maybe the heart didn't burn because Joan of Arc's story wasn't meant to end in the flames. The fire was just the crucible. What came out of it wasn't ash. It was an icon. So, we leave it to you. In the cold, hard light of history, what do you believe? Was the unburnable heart a genuine miracle? A divine no to a corrupt court? Or was it a freak occurrence of the fire, a biological anomaly that has been amplified by the legends of a grieving nation? Let me know in the comments below what you think. Was it a miracle or a mystery of science? Joan of Arc was a girl who saw voices and moved mountains. They tried to erase her, but they only made her eternal. If you enjoyed this dive into the darker side of history, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a mystery. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of the past.